Good morning, everyone. I am Ian Williams, and this is the Foreign Press Association in New York. And it gives us great and timely pleasure to welcome Ambassador John Bolton to speak with us. He's one of the few straight talkers on either side of the House about the current presidential races. I have to say, it's one of the great mysteries in history how Kamala Harris suddenly went from a no-hoper with no experience and no charisma to the world's best presidential candidate in a solid 3 days of Joe Biden melting down in a press conference. It's usually the same pundits were saying that she was hopeless, who are now saying that she is the salvation of the Democratic Party and of the United States. I have to say that Ambassador Bolton has tended to have a steady, acerbic view of all of the candidates from the beginning. So I don't look for rushes of enthusiasm. Um, Enlightened cynicism was my description of my own point of view on this. So, John, here we are. It's just ending up in Chicago. The Democrats seem on a roll, and they actually got foreign policy on in the sense they had a panel on the Middle East, but they haven't got around to mentioning China yet. And the other foreign policy related issue is, of course, immigration and its potential for alienating all of our neighbors. So, how do you assess the current state of play on the presidential races?
Well, I think glad to be back with you. It's a good timing here on the last day of the Democratic convention. I think that Harris, in a totally policy-free way, has made up the deficit that Biden had created both before the disastrous presidential debate and in the months leading up to it. I think it's probably even now between her and Trump, and maybe she's a little bit ahead. We have Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s press conference tomorrow, where at least some media are saying he's going to withdraw and perhaps even endorse Trump. We'll see if that turns out to be the case. But the next big event really is the September 10th debate between Trump and Harris, and we'll see whether she's capable of doing 90 minutes of a debate, and we'll see what kind of performance Trump turns in. And it has been a remarkably policy-free contest so far. Trump is simply repeating how terrible the world is and how persecuted he is and how he's going to get retribution on the people who stole the 2020 election from him. This week, he was supposed to be giving substantive policy addresses, but he seems too bored by the whole thing to really continue with it. And Harris, I think, in a politically astute way, is staying away from policy too. Why talk about policy when she's benefiting from the enthusiasm over the fact she's not Joe Biden? I think she'll come out of this convention I assume her speech tonight will be given plaudits by the news media, and she'll get a bump from the convention. Then you're into the Labor Day holiday, school starts again, and it really is the September 10 debate that's the next big issue. The problem for both Trump and Harris in terms of foreign and defense policy is the rest of the world isn't waiting around to see what happens. And I think right now there are obviously two key questions that people are looking at that could have an impact on the election. The first is Ukraine and the really remarkable Ukrainian success in finding a hole in the Russian defense, penetrating Russian territory, and seizing a number of pretty important locations. Whether they can hold that territory or not is an open question. Whether they should try and hold it or whether they should declare victory and bring their troops back. But here's an issue where Harris will have a very difficult time trying to pull away from what the Biden policy on Ukraine has been for 2.5 years now. She's been in all the NSC meetings, I assume, on this, and it's something that she either has to spell out her differences or defend what Biden's been up to. And Trump has made it clear he doesn't think much of the continuation of this war. He said he could end it in a day if he could get Zelensky and Putin in a room together. That's ridiculous, of course, but that's Trump speaking about the only thing that's really important to him, and that, of course, is Donald Trump. So Ukraine, something could happen on the battlefield or in strikes that the two parties are taking respectively in deep behind their enemy lines. The Ukrainians trying to attack Moscow with drones just a few days ago, and Russia having already caused significant damage to Ukraine's economy, its power system in particular, over the past 2.5 years. And so that is something that could be a subject of the September 10 debate and could have an impact over the next 2 months. The Middle East is obviously the more pressing, probably the most pressing issue for Washington at the minute. The Biden administration is engaged in what I think is a fruitless effort to get a ceasefire for hostages deal with respect to Gaza. The Iranians are trying to make a decision what to do in response to Israel's assassination of Ismail Haniyeh a couple of weeks ago now in Hanoi, Freudian slip, in Tehran. My goodness, I don't know where that came from. It really was humiliating for the Iranians in their capital city, in a secure compound in that city, purportedly through a bomb that the Israelis planted 2 months before Haniyeh even showed up. So I think the Iranian leadership is going to be hard pressed to restore its credibility and its reputation unless they take a pretty strong strike against Israel. But on the other hand, I think they're very worried that if they do that, this time the Israelis might not succumb to American pressure and limit their response. This time, maybe they'll go after the Iranian nuclear program or go after Iran's oil terminal facilities on the Gulf or some really serious targets. So I think Iran is happy to hide behind this negotiation. It, at a minimum, gives them more time to try and figure out what to do. But I don't think peace is about to break out in the Middle East, not even in the Gaza Strip. And therefore, by definition, there's almost certainly going to be some impact on the election. The Democratic Party still has to see play out tonight the last effort by the pro-Palestinian delegates and demonstrators outside the convention. This represents the real left wing of the Democratic Party. But in a close election, the Democrats need all of their constituency groups to come out and vote against Trump. We'll see how they handle it tonight. And then finally, and I'm happy to answer questions on all these different areas. Finally, we've got China, which is clearly watching the constraints on American bandwidth. We've got a war in Eastern Europe. We've got a war in the Middle East. We've got this all-consuming presidential election, and it would seem a ripe opportunity for China and other troublemakers to take advantage of that limited American bandwidth. In China's case, to make some kind of threat toward Taiwan, to do something provocative in the South China Sea or along their Asian land borders. So far, we haven't seen activity during this election period. But it's 2 months until the election, 4 months roughly until a new president. And we know by definition there will be a new president. So whether during the pre-election period or during the transition period after the election, these historically have been times of uncertainty and preoccupation in the United States. So I still think there's a significant risk China may try and take advantage of it. So that's the situation now. It may seem calm, but I think we're in really a potentially very disruptive period here, depending on what happens on lands far removed from where the U.S. is going to hold its election.
Faraway countries of which we know little. As
something like that. That's the isolationist approach following Neville Chamberlain.
But I mean, on that level, the Republicans have tended to be more isolationist than most, but Trump is making a fetish of Ukraine and his ability to handle it at one blow. And doesn't he risk alienating his base by being so sort of instinctively sympathetic to Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think he does not represent the broad opinion within the within Republicans in the United States and really in the country generally that remains very sympathetic to assisting the Ukrainians. Part of this boast that if I just could get Zelensky and Putin in a room together, I can solve it, is a typical Trump assertion. It's neither provable nor disprovable. There's no way you can argue logically one outcome is more likely than the other or that either outcome is possible. It's just Trump saying, I alone can fix it, as he said at the Republican convention in 2016. It's very similar to him saying, if I had been president, Putin never would have invaded Ukraine. Well, you can't prove that either, and you can't disprove it. But it all turns on that central issue for Trump, which is Donald Trump. I think it necessarily disturbs the Ukrainians, and it should, because it relates to the still looming issue of what Trump would do in terms of pulling out of NATO or reducing American involvement in NATO if he became president. And it also raises the question of Trump's relationship with Vladimir Putin. If they had this hypothetical meeting of Zelensky, Putin, and Trump in a room somewhere, and after 24 hours there was no solution, as there would not be a solution after 24 hours, it's obviously somebody's fault. It's not Trump's fault because he never makes mistakes. So it must be the fault of either Zelensky or Putin. And that's where the Putin relationship with Trump, I think, augurs very poorly for Zelensky and Ukraine.
On that connection, I mean, we've had various forms of Russophilia and Russophobia. 2 or 3 years ago, would it have been conceivable that Ukraine could have not only held out this long, but launched an incursion into what was supposed to be the Russian heartland and done it fairly successfully? As you say, they're not even claiming to be after territorial aggrandizement, but it should prick Putin's bubble as far as his boasts. I mean, this was an operation that was supposed to be over in 2 weeks with the Russian flag flying over Kiev by now. So,
yeah. Well, look, they're notwithstanding the fact that Ukraine is still fighting, which a lot of people didn't expect. That just underlines, I think, many of the problems with the Biden administration policy that we know American intelligence briefed the Senate and the House in what were supposed to be closed sessions a few days after the Russian invasion on February 24th and 22. And we know from multiple members of the House and Senate who came out and told us what they said, which they weren't supposed to do, but how do you stop them? That they were briefed that Kiev would fall in a number of days and the country a few weeks later. And that was one of the arguments that the Pentagon made in 2021 and 2022 not to supply additional weapons to Ukraine, because it would only be a short matter of time before they fell into Russian hands. Obviously, though, that intelligence proved to be quite wrong. We may have gotten it right that the Russians were about to invade, but we're very badly wrong on what the course of the conflict would be. And it shows, the first Russian troop movements in substantial numbers toward the Ukrainian border were in February of 2021, 1 year before. And it took them a while to build up, but during that time, neither we nor other NATO countries really made an effective effort to deter the Russians, as I say, by providing Ukraine with additional weapons or whatever. So now, because of the way we have finally aided Ukraine after the invasion, the situation at least in the Donbass is pretty much in gridlock. This Ukrainian incursion really is the biggest news in quite some time. But in a war of attrition, if it continues, Russia's population is 3.5 times the size of Ukraine. Eventually, the bigger party wears the lesser party down. And I think Ukraine has that to worry about, because it's not just Donald Trump and his views that they have to worry about. They have to worry about European countries. losing interest, saying, look, this has gone on long enough. Let's get to the negotiating table, which the Ukrainians don't want to do, but it's obviously not entirely in their hands.
So, Kira McGrath wants to know, what does the Ukraine Kursk operation tell us about Russia's military, and how will it have been viewed in the Kremlin? In the sense that the only other power structure in Russia is the military. Are they going to get tired of this, to see all of their, see their humiliation on the world stage effectively?
Yeah. Well, it's as I say, you think Russia can't get worse in its military performance, and it does. What happened in this invasion into Russian territory is the Ukrainians obviously saw a weak point or a series of weak points and took full advantage of it. That's very similar to what they did probably a year and a half ago when they swept Russians out of much of northern Ukraine, territory the Russians had taken in the early days of the war. The Ukrainians noticed their positions were undermanned because the troops had been shifted to the Donbass. And in very short order, they pushed the Russians out of all their positions in northern Ukraine that they had taken in the aftermath of the initial invasion. So the effect on the Russian military, I think, has been very, very detrimental. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said probably 2 years ago now that Putin was feeding his army into a wood chipper, and that's what they've continued to do. I think it shows that all of the Russian efforts to overcome corruption, to try and build a really modern army, for 20 years now have proven ineffective. That it's hard to explain the inadequacy of their performance other than by concluding that their units really had not come up to the standards they wanted. They weren't combat ready. Maybe a battalion of 500 men had 300 men in it, but they were saying they were 500 to get the salaries and the rations and the equipment that the commander could then use or sell. I mean, that's how corruption undercuts a military's capability. And certainly the Russians have not achieved anything like what they expected, and they're lucky to be hanging on in some sense, and at a terrible human cost. We don't know really what Russian casualties are. We don't know what Ukrainian casualties are, for that matter, but they've been heavy, and the Ukrainians have also suffered a lot of civilian casualties. So it's been a very costly war for the Russians so far, without a lot of territorial gain to speak of.
Moving on from foreign policy to the broader reaches of the election, one of the big issues that Trump is going to go on is immigration, and his proposal to deport anyone who does any actual work in the United States, in terms of gardening, kitchens, restaurants, and hotels, does not strike most economists as a real rallying call for support. How do you see this conflict, and how can it be reconciled? Because when people say get rid of the immigrants, they say, but not Jose, who's doing my lawn, and not Maria, who's doing my laundry, or not so-and-so who's looking after the kids. That they look at it in broad brushstrokes and ignore the practical details.
Well, I think Trump has made immigration a very significant issue. I think people are worried about who is coming across the southern border, and what the threat they might pose in terms of criminal behavior. I think he's exaggerated the threat, but in the border states along Mexico, they see hundreds, thousands of people coming across every week, every month, and that's why they ship them elsewhere in the country. And it's Governor Abbott of Texas, Governor DeSantis of Florida in particular, have made a specialty out of that. And it's had an amazing effect up in New York or Massachusetts. In Martha's Vineyard, they shipped a plane load of immigrants, illegal immigrants up there. And the people were outraged. Of course, they're all liberal Democrats and a few liberal Republicans saying, what are they doing on Martha's Vineyard? But politically, it's a powerful issue. And Kamala Harris, whether she deserves it or not, was given responsibility for changing economic conditions in Central America to help prevent this flow of illegals. And obviously, not much changed. The Biden administration really created the issue on their own. When Trump left, southern border was largely closed, and the impression was the Biden White House was lifting restrictions, and the refugee illegal immigrant flows increased. People are worried not just about that, but about flow of illegal drugs like fentanyl from production sites in Mexico and other illegal drugs from South America coming through the border, worried about terrorists coming across the border, agents. We've now got a very large number of Chinese who come from China to Latin America and then come across the Mexican border. What's that all about? Some say it's economic opportunity seeking because they see that the economy in China is about to stall out. But it has become a big issue, and I think the Democrats are vulnerable on that issue, which is why Trump keeps pounding on it. What Trump would actually do after he gets elected is anybody's guess. He made noises about it the first time he was elected, and really very little happened in terms of deportation. I do think, as I say, by the end of his administration, the border was largely minimized as a problem, and he may be able to accomplish that again. But in terms of who's already here, I think it's we just haven't seen, and we won't see until he gets elected what he's actually able to do.
I'd love to see a copy of the Mexican check for the wall construction. In the meantime, one of the problems with politics is amnesia. Nobody remembers what anybody said a few weeks before.
Right. Well, Trump benefits from that. People don't remember the confusion and the chaos of his first term, and they've seen weakness and ineffectiveness in Biden's term. That's why the appearance of Kamala Harris is so beneficial. They don't really have to defend Biden's performance because they can say, and this Democratic convention has gone a long way to try and make the case that it's Trump who's the incumbent. He's the current circumstance, and Kamala Harris is the change. That if you don't want to have a repeat of Trump, and as Obama said the other night, the sequel's usually not as good as the original, then Kamala Harris is the answer. Rather than her being part of the incumbent administration, they are trying to portray her, and I think they're doing pretty well at succeeding in portraying her as the force for change versus Trump, the representative of the status quo.
Well, one of the key issues, it's been relatively underplayed compared with the bandwidth it was getting earlier, is the question of Roe v. Wade and abortion. To what extent has Trump managed to do a sidestep around that by saying, "Oh, I was only kidding. I didn't mean it really."
Well, he wants to downplay the issue, which is a difficult issue for Republicans. He's tried to say, look, it's a matter for the states. But the Democrats will pound away on it through election day because they see correctly at the moment that politically it's beneficial for them. I think what's most interesting about Trump is that from taking credit for appointing three Supreme Court justices who voted to overturn Roe v. Wade, and trying to look like he takes a very strong position against abortion. Now he's trying to say, no, a 15-week limit is okay, and a variety of other things to modify his position. He doesn't have a philosophical view on abortion. His view is, what's the best way to use this issue to get elected? And so he may move again. He may change again, depending on how the winds blow on that topic.
Some cynics see some resemblance to Bill Clinton that way, but that's another story.
Heaven forbid I wouldn't say that.
I would. But that's another story. While we've, he is on domestic policy. One of the issues here has been the Supreme Court. Whatever you think of the philosophies, has really produced some outstandingly innovative interpretations of the Constitution over the last few months. Is that going to reverberate at all through the electorate that these Trump nominees are busily rewriting a 200-year-old Constitution?
Well, I don't think that's what they're doing. Actually, I think they're correcting mistakes that have been made in in past Supreme Court decisions, and I think that's important. That's what the effort has been really since the Reagan administration, to get judges and justices who follow the original intent approach to decision making, that you try and find out what the framers of the Constitution or the amendments meant, and not try and elaborate what you would think if you were there writing it with them, or to try and turn it into a policy kind of discussion. I'm not saying I would have agreed with all of the opinions they've written on presidential immunity, for example. I think they got a number of things wrong, but the issue here is, as Roe v. Wade is the best example, that was a decision that had no foundation in the Constitution. And what the court said basically when they overruled Roe was that this is an issue that the Constitution doesn't address, as there are many issues it doesn't address. And therefore, it's for the political decision-making process known as representative government. And if you have a feeling about the issue, go get people elected who are sympathetic to you, which is how in a democratic society, that's how most decisions should be made.
But the Supreme Court recently has taken to overruling legislative decisions that they dislike.
Well, not that they dislike, but that have not, what we've seen for over 100 years is Congress giving vague general delegations of authority to the executive branch to make decisions that really are not the executive branch's to make. They belong to Congress, and it puts the burden back on Congress to do its job, which is long overdue.
Well, that's sort of overridden, as you pointed out, by the presidential immunity decisions.
Well, the immunity, remember, in a case called Nixon against Fitzpatrick back in the 70s, the Supreme Court then, which was not filled with original intent nominees, said that the president had civil immunity for his official acts. And that's so it's not startling that the court would say a president has official immunity, has immunity for criminal immunity for the official acts. I just think they've mistaken what some of the things that that I would call official acts versus the acts of a political nature that all politicians make, and so do presidents. But just because a president does them doesn't give them immunity. We'll see how it plays out in the actual trial, assuming Trump's not elected. If he is elected, we'll never know, because he'll dismiss the cases and the immunity issue won't arise.
It always amuses me as coming from Britain that this is all a replay of sovereign immunity. This is where we came in with King George III.
Well, it's it is an issue that in many cases really is beyond the bounds of judicial review, and it's a matter of politics. And if people don't like it, they shouldn't vote for Donald Trump this November. That's one among many reasons.
And it's one that you would deduce.
Right.
Right. Simon wants to know, do you see any change in the strength of Putin's position domestically in Russia? Is there any chance of a leadership change? And if so, where would it come from?
Well, I think Putin has been humiliated to a certain extent by this Ukrainian incursion. There's no doubt about it. The trouble is there's not really a government in Russia. It's more like a criminal gang. There's one guy at the top of it, and everybody else is subordinate. A lot of the people who were dissidents have either left the country or been eliminated. And it's not clear where opposition to Putin really would come at this point. I don't think he's seriously threatened at the moment, but I do think this: if the military can't resolve this Ukrainian attack, then there could be political consequences. But having a differing point of view is dangerous in Russia. Ask Yevgeny Prigozhin, ask Navalny, Nepsov. I mean, there are any number of political assassinations that have taken place in recent years, and attacks even abroad against the Skripals in England and others. It's a winner take all business in Russia.
Well, when it comes to the economic battle, where Russia is not suffering the way that people anticipated, I mean, we're in a very strange position. It's almost Napoleonic, where the British provided the shoes for Napoleon's army.
Yeah. Well, look, the administration, this is a Biden administration mistake in our view. If you want to prevent the Russians from getting revenue through the sales of their principal products, oil and gas, to the rest of the world, then put in place a sanctions regime that says nobody should buy Russian oil or gas. But that's not what they wanted to do. They were afraid that if they really constricted the flow of Russian petro products onto the world market, it would cause gasoline prices to rise worldwide and therefore rise at the pump for Americans who were planning to vote in November. So they tried to devise a sanction scheme with a maximum price so that Russian oil would still flow, but the Russians wouldn't make too much money off of it. Well, what happens then is so the Chinese, the Indians, and others buy the gas at reduced prices, mix it up a little bit, and then sell it at market prices and probably kick back to the Russians part of the profit they make on it. Russian revenues may be somewhat constrained, probably are less than what they would get if they could sell at world market prices, but it hasn't slowed them down in the cost of the war. It hasn't had a visible effect on Russian living standards internally. And it's made places like China and India quite happy to get cheaper oil. So it just shows you, if you want to play the sanctions card, to have a real impact, you have to mean what you're doing. And I think Russia sees the unwillingness of the U.S. and Europe too, for that matter, to suffer the prospect of higher gasoline prices. That it shows they're not as serious about the war as they say they are.
Well, I personally would have given medals to the people who blew up the Nord Stream, but that's a separate issue.
Right. Well, we'll find out. There are new stories coming out. Who knows whether they're right or not?
Yes. Well, it seems the sensible thing to do, coming from a country that where torpedoes and submarines on the German commerce were the main means of winning the war. It's the logical thing to do. If you
Right.
can blow up oil tankers, then you can blow up oil pipelines.
Right. No, I don't have it. If the Ukrainians did it, I don't have any trouble with it.
So, but how in the long run, what can the U.S. government do? If most of the US electorate doesn't see that we're in a sort of existential struggle with the Russians, so persuading them to make those type of sacrifices, like at the gas pump or whatever, is a reach, let alone any military action.
Well, I mean, I think Biden had a very easy answer if he really had constricted Russia sales internationally of gas and oil, and that is to open more production in the United States. We're awash in oil and gas. He could have kept the domestic price down and sold a fair amount of it overseas if he weren't pursuing the environmental objectives that he made the center of his policy. So, I mean, in a way, it was self-defeating on his part. He didn't need to risk higher prices if he had simply allowed more production on federal lands.
When one of the issues of the current conflict is the importance of allies, or lack of importance, if you want. I mean, here we are, we're confronting the Russians, and the Germans seem to be going out of their way to stick a knife in the back whenever possible, in the sense that they are varying degrees of enthusiasm
Yeah.
based on their
Well,
expediency.
Chancellor Scholz announced the Zeitenwende 2 years ago, the sea change, and I think it's fair to say at this point, what's Zeitenwende? They've offered to spend 100 billion more euros. This year, it may get them over the 2% threshold. We'll see. It depends on how much they actually spend. But every prospect I've seen is that beginning next year, they start dipping below the 2% NATO target again, 2% of GDP. In the world and the threats we see all around, I think a sensible U.S. policy would be to increase its defense spending from something in the nature of 3 1/3% up to Reagan era levels of 5 to 6%. And if we did that, we would expect NATO allies to go to 3 or 4%. In England, they were talking at least about going to 2.5%. So people shouldn't get comfortable that they've gotten near 2% because that may have been a good target in 2014 when it was set after the Russian invasion of the Donbass and the annexation of Crimea then. But it's over 10 years later now, and the world's much more dangerous. China's a much more visible threat. We've got obviously the war in the Middle East to demonstrate the Iranian threat. So if you want to be safe in the wider world, spending more on defense is a prerequisite.
There is the effect on the economies of the countries concerned. I mean, Britain at the moment is, for example, is spending a lot on arms, but is strained to maintain its own economy because of years of mismanagement by all parties about the fundamentals of the economy there. The same for some other European countries. Can they reconcile defense spending with economic growth, or can they combine them into a sort of Rooseveltian, Keynesian approach to economic stimulus?
If you need an economic stimulus, building new weapons is a great way to do it. It employs a lot of people. You can increase the size of your military. I remember at the NATO summit in 2018 in Brussels, when Trump was complaining that European members weren't spending 2% of GDP. One prime minister, whom I will leave blissfully nameless, so as not to embarrass him or his country, said, look, we're trying to spend 2% of our GDP, but our economic growth rate has been fantastically good. And so we're having trouble keeping up. Now, that's a statement that says, we're so rich we can't afford to spend 2% of our GDP on defense. Now, what is it? If your defense is not adequate, if you're not protecting yourselves and your neighbors against foreign adversaries, having a high GDP isn't going to protect you. That's for sure.
There's a question here from Frank Gomez, which I'll put in with an ancillary. What will Harris's security foreign policy team look like, assuming she wins? I have a haunting nightmare that Hillary Clinton is still auditioning for Secretary of State. What do you think?
Well, it wouldn't be surprising. There were rumors that Hillary was ready to be the replacement for Joe Biden if he did step aside, but there didn't seem to be a rush to pick her when he finally did. I don't think we know who Harris's national security advisors will be. I'm not sure she does. She had very little experience in foreign policy other than 3.5 years, presumably, of sitting in meetings of the National Security Council. Maybe she soaked a lot of things up. I think the best prediction that you can make is that if she's elected, the first year or thereabouts of her term will follow the trajectory, the general approach of the Biden administration, because that's what they've been doing. That's what she knows. But as new advisors come on board, as you get a new cabinet, and frankly, as new challenges arise in the world, it's inevitable that she'll depart in some respect from the direction that Biden has been taking. But at this point in the campaign, we don't have a clue. And I'm not sure when she's going to be in a position to give us much indication. As long as it's politically beneficial for her not to say much about policy, I think she won't. And Trump doesn't want to debate policy. He wants to debate Donald Trump. What else is there to talk about? So she may be happy to do just that, which is why to come back again to this September 10 debate, I think people are going to need to pay attention to it.
Do you see any chances of litigious surprises for Trump? Are the court cases out of the agenda for the election, or can they come to haunt him?
I think basically the only question is whether in the New York case the judge proceeds with sentencing, which I think is now scheduled for September the 11th. Trump has moved to put scheduling off until after the election. The Manhattan District Attorney has said he's okay with that. So he's basically left the decision to the judge. If I were to bet on it, I would bet the judge would put it off too, to say, look, there's no good answer to this question. But to avoid being accused of interfering with the election, I think the best thing to do is put it off. None of the other cases, I think, will come to trial before the election. If Trump is elected, he will dismiss the two federal cases. I think that's pretty clear, the January 6th case in Washington and the documents case in Florida. The Georgia and New York state cases he can't dismiss because they're state cases. But what their future is at that point when he's sitting in the Oval Office, if he is reelected, uh, very hard to predict.
So, do you think the appearance of the sergeant from the Capitol Police at the convention would have much effect on the Republican base? I mean, here is everything they want. He's a force of law and order. He's in uniform. He's standing valiantly against the barbarian hordes. And
yeah. Well, it should be a reminder that we have been the party of law and order, that we believe in law and order. We don't believe in people rampaging through the Capitol, disrupting the normal functions of government. But that's the Trump aberration. He's had that effect. It's also why I don't think the Trump aberration continues long after he departs the political scene. If he loses this election, I think he doesn't really have a philosophy to pass on. He has an attitude. Maybe J.D. Vance will pick up that attitude, but I think Trump's influence will disappear pretty quickly if he loses this time.
now you mentioned a name that no one's bothered mentioning so far, J.D. Vance. Is this because of his inconsequentiality and the fact that they were wrong-footed when they put him in before Kamala Harris was nominated?
Well, I don't think it was a good decision on Trump's part. It doesn't expand his base. Trump did something I didn't think he would do. I mean, I confess I had it wrong. I never thought Trump would pick an heir apparent, but that's what he did. That's what Vance is. My theory was based on the idea that if you name a crown prince, as the saying goes, uneasy is the head that wears the crown. People would say, "Hey, there's a replacement for Trump. Maybe it's time to get rid of Trump." But he was overconfident. He thought he would be running against Biden. He thought it was a safe pick. I think it'll come back to hurt him in the election.
I suspect that if the alternative is Trump or J.D. Vance, people who would otherwise definitively say not Trump will be thinking twice just in case.
Right.
What are there enough wars and conflicts that the press should be paying more attention to for their potential long-term consequences? You know, the foreign policy is obviously extremely important for the US, as you've always demonstrated and adumbrated, but it's not something that's usually big unless there's a war on the electoral scene, and yet Americans expect their president to be their figurehead internationally. If the president doesn't cut the mustard internationally, it does reflect back on the domestic base, doesn't it?
Right. Well, that's why there's not enough debate about foreign policy in presidential elections. If you compare it to the amount of time a president actually spends on national security once in office, it's enormous compared to the time spent these days in election campaigns. But we've got two active wars underway now. They have had an impact, certainly the Middle Eastern conflict, on the politics inside the Democratic Party with an unexpectedly large left-wing pro-Palestinian contingent. We may see some impact of that tonight at the convention when Kamala Harris gives her acceptance speech. Ukraine has motivated a lot of people for and against. And there could be a development in one of these conflicts, or as we discussed earlier, the Chinese could take advantage of our focus on other issues to make an aggressive move in their neighborhood, and that would immediately bring national security right to the center of the debate.
Now, on the Middle East issue, since you mentioned it, what Kamala Harris has managed to do is to, let's say, resecure the loyalty of the party members who are put off by the 100% Israel or nothing view from Biden. Now, isn't there a sort of element? How would Trump have taken being snubbed repeatedly by Netanyahu? The same way that Biden has. He's saying, please, pretty please, don't invade, don't blow up a school this week. And immediately afterwards, the bombers go in. And
Yeah.
it seems like Netanyahu has deliberately been tweaking Biden's nose, it would appear.
Well, I think he's doing what he thinks he needs to do to keep the threat from Iran under control. And he's under enormous White House pressure. Trump has been saying that Israel needs to wrap the conflict in Gaza up because they're getting a lot of criticism, which could mean, look, either finish Hamas off and get it over with, or stop right now. It's not quite clear, but the formulation that Trump uses about Israel being criticized shows what he's really worried about. He thought his support for Israel was all plus for Donald Trump. And now Israel's getting criticized, and he's got to defend Israel from the criticism, which he doesn't want to do. And he's worried the criticism will rub off on him. So his preferred position is no criticism of me, of course. Tell the Israelis to get this thing finished off. We don't know what he'll do when he gets in. He doesn't know what he'll do either. It doesn't bother him because he knows nobody can hold him responsible until he's actually elected. But it is a real problem, and it shows the variability of things that happen internationally. They're simply not controllable because of the American political schedule.
Yes, and because foreigners don't always pay attention to American electoral priorities.
Right. That's right.
Like that.
Right.
Are there any other issues around the world? I mean, Africa.
Well, the last one, I guess I'd mention is Venezuela, where we have Maduro. He's now looking for a world record of how many elections he can steal. He stole the 2018 election in Venezuela. He's stolen the 2024 election. The Biden White House, in an act of stunning naivete, before the election, agreed to weaken the sanctions that had been imposed on Maduro after he stole the 2018 election, after Maduro said, I'll hold free and fair elections, which any third grader could have told Biden he wasn't going to do, and he didn't. And so now the opposition is hiding out in the Argentinian embassy in Caracas, I suppose, hoping for a helicopter to get him out of the country at some point. Maduro is still in power. The people are oppressed, and the influence of Russia, Cuba, and China increases, and it doesn't get much press attention, and it's bad for the stability of the Western Hemisphere, and will get worse as long as Maduro's there.
What are the realistic options for a U.S. administration in connection to Venezuela?
Well, I think if we went back to the sanctions we had before and enforced them, that there's at least some chance that Maduro's resistance could be worn down. But the administration has shown itself not to have a backbone, and nothing's going to happen now on a lot of fronts between now and the election, certainly, or between now and January 20. A lot of people may be waiting for Trump. There's some feeling that that's what Netanyahu's doing. He's stalling, hoping Trump will win. That may be possible, but I wouldn't count on Trump being as pro-Israel in a second term as he was in the first term. Remember, he can't run for president again, and so the politics of a second Trump term are going to be very different from the politics of a first term.
So he will take personal slights by Netanyahu.
Well, I think he believes he's going to stop the war in the Middle East too when he raises his right hand on January the 20th. Again, there's no reason to think that's true, and there's no way you can prove that he's wrong until January the 20th comes. Then we'll see.
He probably has the tablets of stone already written out, ready to bring down from the mountain. Question from William Y. What's the likelihood that Bibi is holding out for a Trump victory before agreeing to some deal brokered by the US, Qatar, Saudi, etc.? And what would such a deal look like? I'm personally, I should add, I'm unconvinced. I think people consistently misunderestimating George W. Bush's favorite phrase, the role of domestic politics, even in Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Yes, they might be autocracies, but there are some issues that burn and resonate. And the Palestinian issue is one in all of these countries.
Well, I think it resonates less these days than before. I think the Abraham Accords have shown that there's more commonality between Israel and certainly the Gulf Arab states than people thought. They see the principal threat to their peace and security as being Iran. So having relations with Israel, who sees it exactly the same way, makes a lot of sense. And I think the Saudis would like to get to that point. They obviously can't. as long as Gaza is the subject of this conflict. But there's still a lot of hard issues that need to be resolved. I think Netanyahu is moved more by his own sense of what's necessary and their own domestic politics. He's got a very difficult government to keep together, and they haven't yet achieved their objective of eliminating Hamas militarily and politically. They're very close. They've done enormous damage to Hamas. But as long as Yahya Sinwar is still down there in those tunnels somewhere, presumably with most of the remaining Israeli hostages as human shields, I think Israel's interest in getting to him and getting the hostages out remains a very important objective.
Uh, and on a sort of personal level, I presume you're not sitting by the phone waiting for the call from either of the president from any White House for a new position.
Now, I expect to be in the private sector on January the 21st of next year, regardless of the election result, and I will enjoy it too.
Well, it's a good place to be in from the outside looking in on the circus, isn't it?
Right.
Better than being there with the elephants stampeding. We're getting towards the end. Are there any last questions from people? Or are there any further thoughts you'd like to add? Oh, yes, because one of the other things Trump benignly neglects any form of principle. Is Kosovo and the Balkans in real danger if Trump wins? I mean,
Well,
he sells the farm everywhere else in the world. Can he sell the farms there?
There were efforts to try and get a end to the dispute between Kosovo and Serbia in the Trump years. The Europeans hadn't produced a solution. Neither did the various efforts in Trump's administration I participated in. I thought they were worth doing, but they didn't get anywhere. I'm very worried about Russian meddling in the Balkans. I mean, this is a historical play for them in Serbia in particular, but in Romania, in Bulgaria, in some of the other countries. And I don't think the current administration has really paid any more attention to it than Trump did during his years. And when you don't, you can suffer the consequences. Certainly, this is a great concern to Greece, and we should have been more active. We should be generally, because the conflicts and disagreements in the Balkans that are still unresolved years after the end of the Cold War, the breakup of Yugoslavia, and the Warsaw Pact, as the Russians under Putin try to reestablish the Russian Empire, which really is his objective. Expanding their influence and causing trouble in the Balkans is part of that play. And I do think they're at work, and I don't think we're really paying enough attention to it at this point.
It is, of course, dangerous. Sarajevo has precedence.
Right. Look, it's why people may not pay attention to it, but it doesn't mean that that real trouble couldn't begin there. I mean, if you consider the Balkans in a slightly expanded fashion, Moldova still has Russian troops on its soil. It still has the breakaway, quote unquote, Republic of Transnistria that the Moldovan government has not been able to assert control over, and it's that kind of thing. It's a frozen conflict in Moldova, but that is an issue that has echoes in many of the Baltic countries that the Russians may try and make more active.
Just tangentially for that, before we go, Cyprus and Turkey, any serious problems there, or is it just?
Well, I don't see much room for movement. The Turkish position hasn't changed. The government of Cyprus hasn't changed. The Greeks haven't changed. It's speaking of frozen conflicts, that's one of your classic UN failures there. That UNFICYP has been there since 1974, I think. The peacekeeping force, no sign of its imminent departure.
Yes, I've walked along the Green Line. Hang on, one last question before we come. If Trump is re-elected, do you think he might actually withdraw from NATO this time?
Yes, I think it's a very real possibility. I wrote in my book about how close he came at the Brussels summit in 2018 that I mentioned, the NATO summit, and I've written on it since then. It's his grievances have not gone away. They're trying to downplay the potential for withdrawal during the campaign because I think it is a very foolish position. It would be a catastrophic mistake. for the United States to withdraw, but I think that's still what Trump's instinct is, very definitely.
And do you think this is based on shrewd geopolitical calculations or because of a parcel of brown paper parcel full of used dollars passed over by Russian agents?
Well, I don't know that we have any evidence of the latter. But look, Trump thinks that the EU is unfair to the U.S. on trade negotiations. He thinks that there's still too many countries that haven't hit the 2% of GDP defense spending. And as I say, if America finds the need to go up, the Europeans will need to come up as well. It's not. This is not a bargaining position for Trump to induce members not at the 2% level to reach the level. It's not a sophisticated bargaining strategy. He just doesn't like and doesn't understand our foreign alliance structures. And what applies to NATO, I'm afraid, could apply to the alliance with Japan, the alliance with South Korea, and others. It's one of the reasons Trump is so dangerous.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Bolton, and look forward to seeing what you do in the private sector in January.
We'll see.
Shooting
Glad to
from
be
the
with
stars.
you. Thanks for everybody attending.
Everybody else, we have two events coming up. One without a date, but we've invited Kishore Mahbubani, the former foreign minister of Singapore, who came up with yet another proposal to reform the Security Council of the UN. I'm dubious about his proposal, but we can discuss that with him. He was a straight shooter when he was a delegate at the United Nations. And on the 18th, we'll be having a meetup for Foreign Press Association members at the Fitzpatrick Hotel on Lexington Avenue, to which you are all welcome. Please watch out for details. Thank you very much once again. John Bolton.
Good to be with you.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.